So if there is no consensus around what Greater Manchester Moving actually is, does that matter? And I think this highlights a tension that was described by partners between a movement or a social movement for physical activity, which by very definition needs to extend beyond the reach of those stakeholders very close to the idea of Greater Manchester Moving, so that everybody can own and be active for the physical activity agenda, versus the need identified by some people for there to be an engine room to ensure that physical activity remains a priority and to push forward this agenda across multiple sectors. So if we just take that one step further, one might think of GM Moving as something which integrates with and enhances other work that goes across Greater Manchester. So why this image, an image of a load of mushrooms here? Well, to highlight that a rhizomatic plant has no centre and no defined boundary, and rather it is made up of a number of semi-independent nodes, each of which is capable of growing and spreading on its own, but sometimes even popping up in areas that shouldn't be before disappearing again. So we might ask ourselves, to what extent has physical activity been prioritised and integrated and is shown to be popping up in other areas across Greater Manchester's policy landscape? And one might ask, to what extent have we actually integrated across the network? And what more can we do to actually activate more people? So let's just take a moment now to think about the successes in physical activity integration across Greater Manchester. Well, partners were keen to point out that Greater Manchester Moving and the leaders and personnel associated with Greater Manchester have been instrumental, together with national colleagues from Sport England, in changing the conversation from thinking about individual behaviour change, thinking about individuals and communities and their choices to do physical activity, to now recognising that physical activity success is going to be brought about by thinking about systems, about culture, about the environment and the infrastructure in which we're all operating. And really highlighting that has such great influence on individual decision making, and change needs to be made everywhere. And we also have noted that whilst the conversation may have changed, there are still some fundamental building blocks which support our communities to be active in the leisure sector. And over the COVID-19 crisis, it's been really well recognised that the leadership shown by those in GM Moving has really supported the agenda of the leisure sector, who has been under such threat from the impacts of COVID-19 and the closure to many facilities. This is an example where the loose network of people involved in GM Moving actually can bring about some collaborative power. So people from Greater Sport, from local authorities, the Mayor himself, coming together under the banner of Greater Manchester Moving to support GM Active, make their case for support for leisure centres. Partners also recognise successes in Greater Manchester being a brand under which it was possible to convene people with an interest in physical activity. This relates to the previous point around a social network, that people may not necessarily associate their work with Greater Manchester Moving, but they do want to network with, to share ideas, to build morale with partners across the city region, and Greater Manchester Moving is an umbrella under which that can be achieved. So for example, we've seen year on year a really increase in interest in physical activity, which might be demonstrated by increased numbers of interest in people attending the Greater Manchester Moving conference, attending lunch with Andy Burnham. When they're there is a notable increase in the amount of debate and connectivity that is observed. And key external programmes such as the Daily Mile are telling us and showing us that they see Greater Manchester as a pioneer for physical activity across the system. Another key achievement identified by partners was the really strong relationship that GM Moving has developed with a key national funder in Sport England. And this is shown as a really intriguing development and demonstrating to other partners across Greater Manchester and potentially other national funders as to what partnership can look like, where the relationship has moved between just a transactional exchange of money for programs into a partnership working together to actually try to achieve the ambitions of the national funder. Reflect now on some of the tensions and some of the challenges that partners recognise in this work. We really want to sort of again focus on the challenge of GM Moving driving the agenda, or the extent to which they've been able to stimulate distributed leadership, where there are clear leaders in every sector across Greater Manchester who are pushing physical activity forward. And I think people recognise on the whole that there's still some work to do to ensure that physical activity agenda is distributed and prioritised across the system, which means how active are people for this agenda beyond those who have an authentic interest in physical activity. And the World Health Organization states strongly that it should be a whole of government, whole of society approach. And so perhaps that means there is a need to work and identify those who may not have an authentic interest in physical activity thus far, but we need to cultivate and create it in areas of key opportunity for Greater Manchester Moving. And we've already identified that there might be some gaps in reach, in some key sectors around primary care with children and young people, around crime and with welfare, that do appear to be key areas for Greater Manchester Moving stakeholders to work more closely. And then there are two kind of very key challenges for the work of Greater Manchester Moving, and that is to ensure its relevance to what we might describe as the super priorities of Greater Manchester at the moment. In this period of time, whilst we're still dealing with and coming out of the crisis brought about by COVID-19, and those super priorities might be around inequalities, economic recovery, obviously protection against or around the recovery from COVID, and education. And it's absolutely key for Greater Manchester Moving to ensure it is seen as relevant and to demonstrate its contribution to those super priorities. And currently partners were unsure of the real impact in those areas that could be claimed thus far.